In front of thousands of people, the country's most famous singer pointed at the janitor and said, "Sing, prove you're worth something, or go back to scrubbing floors." No one knew that single father had a voice powerful enough to destroy her. The house lights were still low, but the chandeliers above the theater were already warming up, casting a soft amber glow over rows of red velvet seats. The kind of glow meant for people in tailored suits and polished shoes, not for a man like Ethan Miller. Ethan stood at the very back of the auditorium, hands wrapped in worn yellow rubber gloves, slowly pushing a mop across the floor. The smell of cleaning solution mixed with old wood and dust. Familiar, grounding, almost comforting. He worked carefully, methodically, the way people do when they have learned not to draw attention to themselves. On stage, technicians tested microphones. A single note echoed, sharp and loud, then cut off. Ethan paused for half a second, his grip tightening around the mop handle. His shoulders stiffened, as if his body remembered something his mind tried hard to forget. 5 years ago, this place would have made his heart race for a very different reason. Now he kept his head down. Ethan was 33, but the lines around his eyes made him look older. Weathered, exhausted, quietly resilient. His jacket was a size too thin for the Chicago winter. The cuffs frayed, the name of the theater stitched on the chest like a badge he never asked for. Most people passed him without looking twice. To them, he was just part of the building. Furniture that moved. From the front rows came laughter. Easy, careless laughter. The kind that belonged to people who didn't count hours or dollars. Tonight was a big night. A charity gala. A famous singer. Influencers, donors, cameras. The kind of event the city talked about the next morning. Ethan finished one aisle and leaned on the mop, catching his breath. He glanced up at the stage without meaning to. For a brief, dangerous moment, he imagined himself standing there instead. Under the lights, heart pounding, voice steady. The thought hit him like a punch to the chest. He swallowed hard and looked away. That life was gone, or at least that's what he told himself every morning. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. Ethan froze. He wiped his hands on his jeans before checking the screen. A message from the hospital. His daughter, Mia. He didn't open it right away. He stood there, surrounded by empty seats and rising noise, feeling the familiar pressure settle in his chest. Anxious, protective, afraid. Whatever the message said, it mattered more than anything happening in this building. Finally, he unlocked the phone. As he read, his jaw tightened. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket, straightened his shoulders, and picked up the mop again. Whatever was coming tonight, lights, music, humiliation, or hope, Ethan Miller was already used to surviving in the shadows. He just didn't know yet that the shadows were about to disappear. 5 years earlier, Ethan Miller hadn't been mopping floors. He had been standing backstage under blinding white lights, a thin headset wire pressed against his cheek, his heart racing with a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. The final night of American Sound was minutes away. Producers rushed past him, shouting cues. Somewhere beyond the curtain, thousands of people were chanting his name. Ethan was the favorite. Judges had called his voice rare, effortless, emotionally precise, the kind that couldn't be trained, only revealed. Social media had already decided his future for him. Record deals, tours, a life where money wasn't something you counted in your head at night. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, breathing slowly, grounding himself the way his vocal coach had taught him. That's when his phone vibrated. Once see, then again. Ethan frowned and pulled it from his pocket. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code made his stomach drop. Chicago. The hospital. "Mr. Miller," the voice said when he answered. Calm. Too calm. "Your wife has been admitted to the ER. She's in critical condition." The hallway seemed to tilt. Laura, 8 months pregnant. A cough that never went away. A doctor's appointment she promised was nothing serious. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice already shaking. "Severe pneumonia. We need you here immediately." He didn't ask how long he had. He didn't ask what would happen if he didn't come. Ethan looked toward the stage curtain, glowing with promise. He could hear the crowd. He could hear his name. Then he turned and ran. No announcement, no explanation, no goodbye to the cameras waiting for him to step into the light. By morning, the headlines were brutal, unprofessional, unreliable. Another talent who couldn't handle pressure. No one asked where he went. No one wanted the answer. And 5 years later, standing in the back row of a quiet theater, Ethan still carried the weight of that night, unforgiven, misunderstood, and irrevocably changed. Ethan arrived at the hospital just after midnight, his jacket half-zipped, his hands still shaking from the drive. The emergency room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, unforgiving and cold. Laura was already unconscious. A nurse met him near the nurse's station and spoke in the careful, measured tone people use when they're trying not to break someone. Severe pneumonia, oxygen levels dangerously low, complications from the pregnancy, words stacked on top of each other until they stopped making sense. Ethan held Laura's hand in the ICU, tracing the familiar freckles along her wrist. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile, pale, heartbreakingly still. He leaned close and whispered apologies she couldn't hear. Sorry for not pushing her to see a doctor sooner. Sorry for leaving her alone that morning. Sorry for believing everything would somehow be fine. She never woke up. Laura died 3 days later, just as the sun was rising over the city. Their daughter Mia was delivered by emergency C-section hours before that. 6 weeks early, barely 3 pounds, her tiny chest struggling to rise and fall. The doctor explained it gently. A congenital heart defect. Surgery would be needed one day. Maybe soon, maybe later. No guarantees. Ethan signed papers with hands that no longer felt like his own. Outside the hospital room, his phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from producers, missed calls, news alerts. Someone had leaked the story. Contestant vanishes hours before finale. Career suicide. No one mentioned his wife. No one mentioned the baby fighting to breathe behind glass. By the time Ethan carried Mia out of the hospital weeks later, he understood something with painful clarity. The world had already moved on. But he hadn't. And in the quiet moments, standing alone in hospital hallways, listening to machines hum, Ethan learned what grief really felt like. Heavy, relentless, and utterly indifferent to dreams. 5 years later, Ethan's world had shrunk to a third-floor walk-up on the south side. 2 small bedrooms, thin walls, and a heating system that only worked when it felt like it. In winter, the air crept in through the window frames, sharp and unforgiving. Ethan learned quickly which blankets to stack and which doors to keep closed. Mia slept in the warmest room. Every morning, Ethan woke before dawn, moving through the apartment with careful, restrained steps, so he wouldn't wake her. He packed lunches with whatever was left from the night before, peanut butter sandwiches, cut apples browning at the edges. Nothing fancy. Enough. He worked 2 jobs now. Days at the theater, nights washing dishes at a diner off Lake Street. His hands were always cracked, his back always sore, his eyes always tired. But when Mia smiled at him in the mornings, bright, trusting, fearless, the exhaustion loosened its grip. The heart condition hovered over everything. Doctor appointments, medication schedules taped to the fridge, words like monitor and risk and eventual surgery. Ethan didn't let himself dwell on the numbers. He focused on what he could control. At night after homework and baths, Ethan sat beside Mia's bed and sang. Softly, carefully. Songs Laura used to love. Songs he once sang on big stages but now kept just for the 2 of them. Mia would close her eyes and whisper, "Your voice makes my chest feel calm, Daddy." The nurses noticed it too. Her heart rate steadied when he sang. No one could explain why. Ethan didn't try to. He didn't think of it as a gift or a miracle. He thought of it as a promise. To Laura, to Mia, to himself. A promise that no matter how small their life became, it would be built on steadfast love, quiet courage, and an unbreakable bond. And for now, that was enough. The posters went up on a Monday. Ethan noticed them taped to the glass doors of the theater as he clocked in for his shift. Sleek black flyers with gold lettering announcing a charity gala hosted by Vanessa Cole. A Grammy-winning artist, a household name. The headline read, "Voices for Tomorrow Supporting Children with Heart Conditions." Ethan stopped walking. He read the line again, slower this time, his pulse picking up. Children with heart conditions. The words felt personal, almost invasive. He folded the thought away and grabbed his cart, telling himself not to read too much into it. Big events always sounded generous. Reality was usually more complicated. By midweek, the theater buzzed with preparation. Catering trucks lined the alley. Lighting rigs were hauled in. Staff whispered about donors and celebrities. Ethan kept to the edges, working silently, observant, withdrawn, cautious. On the night of the rehearsal, he was assigned to clean the balcony level. From there, he had a clear view of the massive screen behind the stage. As technicians ran visuals, photos flashed by, smiling children, hospital rooms, hopeful slogans. Then Ethan froze. One image lingered longer than the others. Mia, her hospital photo, the one taken during her last cardiology visit, the one Ethan had reluctantly approved after the nurse promised it was for a good cause. His chest tightened. Vanessa stepped onto the stage moments later, flawless and confident, her voice filling the empty room as she rehearsed. She spoke about hope, about fighting for children who couldn't fight for themselves. The crew applauded politely. Ethan didn't. He stared at Mia's face on the screen, a mix of pride and fear twisting inside him. This gala could raise enough money to change their lives, enough to bring surgery closer, enough to let him breathe again. But as Vanessa began to sing, something unsettled him. The sound was powerful, polished, but when she approached the high note everyone waited for, Ethan's brow furrowed. His ears, trained long ago, caught a subtle disconnect, a shine that didn't belong to a human throat. Ethan lowered his mop slowly, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, hope and doubt collided, and neither one was willing to back down. Ethan told himself to ignore it. He rinsed his mop in the utility sink, squeezed out the water, and went back to work. Big stars used all kinds of tricks. Everyone knew that. It wasn't his business. It shouldn't matter. But his body didn't listen. From the balcony, Vanessa Cole's voice floated through the hall again as she repeated the song. The lower notes were solid, controlled, confident, professionally polished, exactly what people expected. Crew members nodded along, satisfied. Then the melody climbed. Ethan stopped moving. When Vanessa reached for the signature high note, the sound rang out perfectly, too perfectly. It sat on top of the music instead of inside it, glossy and weightless. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew that sound, not from jealousy, from experience. That wasn't a live voice. His hands trembled as memories surfaced. Long nights training his ear, learning how breath, resonance, and strain revealed themselves in real time. He could hear the difference between effort and illusion, between flesh and speakers. Vanessa cleared her throat and laughed lightly. Dry air, she joked to the sound tech. Can we boost the track a bit? The technician complied. The note returned flawless. Ethan felt something shift inside him. Uneasy, alert, conflicted. 5 years ago, Vanessa Cole had been one of the judges who dismissed him on national television. If you don't respect the opportunity, you don't deserve the dream. Her words had followed him into every job interview, every rejection. Now here she was, preaching honesty and hope, while hiding behind a recording. Ethan leaned against the railing, staring at the empty stage. If he stayed quiet, no one would ever know. The gala would raise money. Mia might benefit. Silence would be easier. But silence had a cost. And as Ethan thought of his daughter lying in a hospital bed, believing in a woman who wasn't telling the truth, he realized something with chilling clarity. This wasn't just about music. It was about what kind of father he was willing to be. The gala began at 7 sharp. The theater was unrecognizable now, filled with donors in dark suits, camera crews weaving between aisles, soft laughter echoing off the walls. The air smelled like perfume and expensive wine. Ethan stayed near the wings, finishing his shift, hoping to slip out unnoticed. He didn't make it. Vanessa Cole stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause, radiant and self-assured. She spoke about generosity, about giving children a future. The crowd leaned in, moved, receptive, eager to believe. Then her eyes flicked toward the side of the stage. Ethan felt it before he understood it. The sudden stillness, the spotlight snapping in his direction. Vanessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, she said brightly, we have a familiar face here tonight. A murmur rippled through the room as the camera zoomed in. That man over there, Ethan Miller. Some of you might remember him from American Sound. Ethan's stomach dropped. Vanessa tilted her head, amused. A remarkable voice, incredible potential. She paused, letting the words hang. until he walked away right before the finale. The crowd reacted. Whispers, raised brows, quiet judgment. Ethan's heart pounded. He wanted to disappear, to go back to the shadows where he belonged. Instead, Vanessa beckoned him forward. "Come on, Ethan," she said. "Don't be shy. Let everyone see where life takes you when you quit." The walk to the stage felt endless, every step heavy, humiliating, exposed, raw. He could feel millions of eyes on him, both in the room and beyond the cameras. Up close, Vanessa leaned toward him, her microphone lowered. "Fail quietly," she whispered. Ethan lifted his head. Under the lights, in his janitor's uniform, with nowhere left to hide, something inside him hardened. Not anger, not revenge. Resolve. Because if he turned away now, this lie would stand. And one day Mia would watch this moment and see her father shrink. Ethan took the microphone. And for the first time in 5 years, he didn't step back. Ethan stood center stage, the microphone heavy in his hand. The applause had faded into an uneasy silence, the kind that pressed against the ears. From the front row, donors watched with polite curiosity. Online, thousands of comments were already scrolling past faster than anyone could read. Vanessa smiled at him, serene and practiced. "Go ahead," she said. "Sing something. Remind us why you mattered once." Ethan didn't answer right away. He took a breath, slow, deliberate, then looked out past the lights, past the faces, past the cameras. Somewhere in a hospital room, Mia was probably watching, believing, trusting. "Before I sing," Ethan said calmly, "I have a question." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, amused. "This should be good. Can you turn off the backing track?" The room shifted. Vanessa laughed lightly, waving a hand. "That's part of the arrangement." "You didn't use it during rehearsal," Ethan replied. His voice was steady, measured, unflinching. "You sang alone." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Vanessa's smile tightened. "Sound check isn't a performance." "Then sing first," Ethan said. "Just you, no track, so I can learn how you do it." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The band froze. The sound technician hesitated, fingers hovering. Vanessa stared at Ethan, the mask slipping just enough to reveal something colder underneath. "You want me to prove myself to you?" she asked sharply. "I want the truth," Ethan said simply. The silence grew heavier. Finally, Vanessa turned to the booth. "Fine, kill the track." The music stripped away instantly, leaving the stage exposed and bare. Vanessa lifted the microphone and began to sing. At first, her voice soared, strong, confident, familiar. The crowd relaxed, reassured. Then the melody climbed. Ethan watched closely. When Vanessa reached for the note, her neck tightened. Her breath caught. The sound cracked. Sharp, strained, unmistakably short of where it needed to be. Gasps scattered through the theater. Vanessa stopped, laughed too quickly, and took a sip of water. "Dry throat," she said. "That's why professionals use tracks." Ethan didn't raise his voice. "You can't sing it," he said. The words landed hard. Vanessa's eyes burned as she turned toward him. "Then prove it," she snapped. "You sing, right now." Ethan closed his eyes. There was no safety net left. Ethan nodded once. The band looked to him, uncertain. He swallowed, adjusted the microphone, and spoke quietly. "Same song. No track, no effects. Just air and silence." The first notes came out soft, careful, restrained, honest. Not a performance meant to impress, but one meant to survive. The melody settled low in his range, familiar as breathing. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, unsure what to expect. Then something changed. As the song moved forward, Ethan's voice opened. It didn't push. It didn't strain. It simply rose, natural and steady, carrying a weight that came from lived experience. Each note landed exactly where it belonged, like he had been saving them for this moment. The room grew still. When the melody climbed toward the place where Vanessa had faltered, Ethan didn't hesitate. He transitioned smoothly, the shift seamless and effortless. The sound bloomed, clear, ringing, undeniably human. Then he reached the note. The high note cut through the theater like light through glass, pure, unbroken. He held it, not to show off, but to let it exist. Unafraid, exposed, real. Someone gasped. Another person stood up without realizing it. Ethan didn't stop there. He let the note fall back into the song, guiding it down gently, in control the entire time. When the final chord faded, silence hung for a heartbeat too long. Then the room erupted. Applause crashed from every direction. People were on their feet, clapping, shouting, some with tears on their faces. Phones rose into the air. The live stream exploded. Ethan stood there breathing hard, stunned. Across the stage, Vanessa looked as if the ground had disappeared beneath her. Her confidence had drained away, replaced by something sharp and frightened. Because in that moment, it was no longer about opinions or rumors. The truth had been heard, and once a voice like that filled a room, there was no taking it back. The applause hadn't even faded before the backlash began. By the time Ethan stepped off the stage, his phone was vibrating nonstop in his pocket. Messages from unknown numbers, missed calls, notifications stacking on top of each other until the screen blurred. Someone had clipped the moment already. Someone had titled it, "Janitor Exposes Star Live on Stage." Backstage was chaos. Agents whispering urgently, staff avoiding eye contact, security hovering nearby. No one congratulated Ethan. No one asked if he was okay. Vanessa disappeared behind a closed door. An hour later, a woman in a tailored Navy suit approached Ethan as he sat on a folding chair near the loading dock. She introduced herself as Marianne Brooks, Vanessa's attorney. Her smile was polite, professional, and completely empty. "Mr. Miller," she said, lowering her voice, "we'd like to resolve this quietly." She laid a folder on his lap. Inside was an offer, staggering, tempting, carefully calculated. A public apology drafted in legal language, a statement claiming he had misunderstood the performance. In return, there would be no lawsuit, no retaliation. And then she added the line that made Ethan's hands go cold. "We're aware your daughter needs surgery," Marianne said smoothly. "Vanessa is willing to cover the full cost." Ethan stared at the paper. The number printed at the bottom was more than he'd earned in years. Enough to save Mia's life. Enough to erase every sleepless night. "If you don't sign," Marianne continued, "this becomes very expensive for you. Defamation, lost income, media scrutiny. Your family will be dragged into it." The choice sat between them, heavy and cruel. Silence for money, for safety, for Mia. Ethan closed the folder slowly. For the first time that night, fear truly set in. Paralyzing, relentless, undeniable. Because this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about what the truth was worth when your child's life was on the line. Ethan didn't sign that night. He went home instead. The city quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Like Chicago itself was holding its breath. Mia was already asleep when he stepped into the apartment, curled on her side beneath a pile of blankets, one small hand tucked under her cheek. Ethan sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. The lawyer's words replayed in his head. "We'll cover the surgery." The offer felt like a rope thrown to a drowning man. Seductive, urgent, terrifying. All he had to do was let go of the truth. Say he was mistaken. Say it never happened. His phone buzzed again. Another headline. Another comment calling him bitter. A nobody chasing attention. He turned the screen face down. Mia stirred and opened her eyes. "Daddy?" Her voice was sleepy, fragile. "Why are people mad at you?" Ethan swallowed. He searched for the right answer. The kind that wouldn't frighten a 6-year-old but wouldn't lie either. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people get upset when you tell the truth." Mia frowned, thinking, "But you always tell me lying is bad." "That's right." She studied his face, then nodded with the simple certainty only a child could have. "Then you did the right thing." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Yes," he admitted. "I'm really scared." Mia reached out and took his hand, her grip warm and steady despite how small it was. "Mommy said being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," she whispered. "It means you don't stop." Something settled inside him then. Clear, painful, unshakable. Ethan kissed her forehead and stood up. He picked up the folder from his bag, opened it one last time, and read the apology written in someone else's voice. Then he closed it and set it on the counter. The next morning he called the lawyer. "I'm not signing," he said. There was a pause on the line. "You understand what this means?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice steady now. "It means my daughter will know who her father is." And for the first time since Laura died, Ethan felt certain he was standing exactly where he was supposed to be. The fallout came fast, and it came hard. By morning, Ethan's name was everywhere. Some people praised him. Others tore him apart. Comment sections turned vicious. Old photos of his apartment surfaced online, cropped and captioned with words like bitter and attention-seeking. Lawsuits were threatened. Interviews were requested, then withdrawn. For a few days, it felt like the world was trying to punish him for daring to speak. But something else happened too. A sound engineer from the gala posted a video, then a former backup singer, then another, and another. Each one said the same thing. Ethan had told the truth. Each came with receipts, emails, contracts, recordings. The noise shifted, slowly, irreversibly. The truth, once exposed, refused to go back into hiding. A nonprofit stepped forward and offered to help with Mia's surgery. Then a local fundraiser. Then musicians Ethan had admired from a distance shared his story, not as gossip, but as courage. Within days, the money was there. No contracts, no silence demanded. Mia's surgery happened 2 weeks later. Ethan sat in the hospital waiting room for 8 hours, his hands clasped, his heart fragile, relentless, hopeful. When the doctor finally came out and said, "She's going to be okay," Ethan broke down in a way he hadn't allowed himself to in years. Mia survived. Life didn't magically become easy after that. Ethan didn't become famous overnight. He didn't chase deals or headlines. He went back to work. He kept singing at night, sometimes for Mia, sometimes for himself. But something inside him had changed. He no longer whispered. Months later, Ethan stood on a small community stage. No cameras, no pressure, just people, real people. He sang with a voice that wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And it was enough. Because this story was never really about music. It was about what happens when an ordinary person refuses to stay silent. About choosing integrity over comfort. About a father deciding what kind of lesson his child would carry into the world. So here's the question for you. If telling the truth could cost you everything, but staying quiet would cost you who you are, what would you choose? And if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been told your voice didn't matter, if you've ever stood at a crossroads between fear and courage, then maybe this story wasn't just Ethan's. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories about real people, real choices, and quiet bravery, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Because the next voice that needs to be heard might be yours.